Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new session of the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago, the first of a spring set of conferences, right, that we will have here dealing with the subject of the relationship between the military and civil society in Mexico, a big topic and of a lot of contemporary relevance. So we will discuss it both in the present and from an historical perspective. And we are extremely excited today to have with us here Jessica Zarkin, who has graciously accepted to participate in this cycle of conferences. Jessica is an assistant professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. She obtained her PhD in government from Cornell University and her BA in political science and international relationship from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, where she's also a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Security, Intelligence, and Governance, CESI. And well, her work has appeared in various journals. I want to mention here, showing how relevant her perspective is for the topic that we're discussing today, the militarization of law enforcement, evidence from Latin America, from perspectives on politics, militarization and perceptions of law enforcement in the developing world in the British Journal of Political Science, and the silent militarization, explaining the logic of military members' appointment as police chiefs in the journal Comparative Politics. So that said, thank you, Jessica, for joining us today. As always, you will speak, the presenter speaks for some 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have a space for questions and debate. I'm sure a lot of people would like to chip in to this discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Let me share my screen and get it to work before I start the presentation. Let me know if you can see it now. Hopefully. Yeah. Great. So thank you again, Juan, for the introduction. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about Mexico and the military today. And I thought that I would start by motivating today's talk. So current discussions on Mexico and the military primarily focus on one of three themes, centering around the executive and the federal government. The first is a participation of the military in policing operations, or what Gustavo Flores Macias and I call the constabularization of the armed forces. The second is the creation of the National Guard and the de facto blurring of the line between the military and the police. And the third and most recent is the militarization of other aspects of governance by current President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, such as the construction of the Mexico City airport on the Tren Maya. And while all of these themes are incredibly important to understand the role of the military in contemporary Mexican politics, and I'm sure most of these will come up during other talks today, I want us to focus not on the federal government, leave the federal government on the side, and instead focus on what I believe is a fascinating yet often neglected story, which is the embeddedness of the military in urban security governance. And more specifically, I'd like to share part of the research that I completed for my doctoral dissertation and current book project on men like Facundo Esteban Cu, who is a military member serving as the local police chief of Soledad de Graciano in San Luis Potosí. Now, two quick side notes. First, throughout the talk, I'm going to use the phrase military chiefs to refer to police chiefs that are military members. And second, by military members, I refer to both retired and on-leave officers. And the goal for today is to answer the question, what explains the appointment of military members as local police chiefs? Now, to give you a quick preview of my argument, whereas conventional wisdom points to structural violence and partisanship as key drivers of police militarization, I argue that the militarization of police leaders responds to political motives. Now, for the rest of this talk, I will first introduce some theoretical propositions on law enforcement militarization and speak about military chiefs. Then I will walk you through my argument, discuss the case selection and data collection efforts, present the research design and quantitative results, then speak about the case of Nuevo León State, provide some concluding remarks, and in the end, I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing theoretical and policy implications for Mexico. Now, the militarization of law enforcement, as most of you I'm sure are aware, refers to the process through which government agencies tasked with providing public safety draw from and pattern themselves around the military model. And although the literature commonly speaks of militarization as a singular process, there are three central mechanisms through which it can occur. militarization by replacement, which stems from politicians' decision to deploy the military for domestic policing, as in the case of Mexico. Operational militarization, which results from changes in policing strategies and service provision, for example, the adoption of military weapons and equipment. And what I call organizational militarization, which involves changes in the police's internal structure and governance, including command structures, administrative processes, and top management. Now, despite its importance for institutional capacity, few studies have centered on this third mechanism. And as a result, a silent type of militarization has largely gone unnoticed. And this is the appointment of military members as local police chiefs. Now, granted, military chief appointments might seem unlikely at first. And this has to do with the idea that the prevalent belief in the literature and even in practice is that, as one of my interviewees really neatly summarizes, blue and green do not go together. But yet, despite this belief, military chief appointments were widespread at the beginning of the 20th century. So, for example, US cities like Berkeley, Savannah, and Philadelphia all had military chiefs, as did Buenos Aires and Mexico City. And military chief appointments have also become a feature of the remilitarization of public safety in Latin America in the last several decades. So starting in the 1990s, politicians began appointing military chiefs in countries like Brazil, El Salvador, and Mexico. Thus, taking into consideration that military chief appointments are widespread demands a deeper understanding of this type of police militarization, which is even more critical if we also consider that police chiefs significantly impact people's lives through things like influencing the leadership training and philosophy and police behavior. Not to mention that military chief appointments pose risks to democracy and citizen security. Appointing military chiefs directly undermines the democratic policing ideal of civilian police forces. Appointing military chiefs also does not guarantee better policing. For example, violence in states, give me a second because my Zoom is acting up. Yeah. So for example, violence in states like Rio de Janeiro and Guerrero persist despite having multiple military chiefs. And entire cities like Querétaro have spent days without police presence due to strikes over civilian officers' discontent with their military commanders. Thus, to rephrase my initial question, if the benefits are questionable and the risk potentially high, then what explains the appointment of these military chiefs? And today I will argue that preferences for militarized policing at the national level result in local military chief appointments because of the coercive pressures and strategic incentives that mayors face to align security institutions. Now, I recognize that there are multiple concepts and parts to my theory. So for the next couple of minutes, I will unpack my theory by first presenting assumptions and scope conditions. I will then talk about policing in federal countries. And then I will speak about Mexico's turn to militarized policing and how this federal security strategy can likely change policing at the local level. So let me start with assumptions and scope conditions. In terms of assumptions, my theory begins with a claim that to understand police chief appointments, we first need to recognize that police are also political institutions. And by that, I mean recognizing that politics plays a crucial role in all aspects of policing, from who is recruited into the force and how communities are policed, all the way to instances of resistance to police reform. And in terms of scope conditions, as I've already previewed in this research, I focus exclusively on policing in federal countries, where overlapping security jurisdiction exacerbates the role of politics in policing. So having clarified that, let me talk about policing in federal countries. Now, unlike countries where a national police force operates locally under central control, police power in federal systems is exercised by units of government with overlapping security jurisdictions. And while federalism enthusiasts argue that this model keeps police responsive to their communities, overlapping security jurisdictions in public safety makes crime prevention significantly more challenging compared to centralized systems for two reasons. First, it gives rise to ambiguity regarding responsibility and authority over the enforcement of the law. And it also creates undesirable conflict between the federal, state, and local governments who must find a way to work together. As a former federal employee explained during an interview, in many instances, the municipality doesn't want to follow the state doesn't want to follow the federation, and the federation doesn't want to follow either of them. and no one trusts each other. And it is for these reasons that federal, state, and local governments have a need to reduce conflict and facilitate interjurisdictional coordination through coordination mechanisms or top-down processes. And one strategy is mimicking a centralized police structure by getting state and local governments to align with the federal government's security strategy. Now, federal governments cannot force state and local governments to align because of constitutional limitations. However, they can coercively pressure them to do so through, for example, direct imposition, attaching strings to the delivery of resources, and political strong-arming. However, the federal government is not the only actor that stands to gain from this alignment. State and local governments might pursue alignment strategically despite the absence of pressures because of its actual usefulness to, for example, facilitate police service delivery, secure resources and assistance, and even to deflect blame for failing to improve public safety locally. So in summary, we should expect that pressures and incentives will both increase the likelihood of a top-down alignment sequence across security institutions, which involves the preferred security strategies of higher governmental levels, influencing and spreading at the lower levels. Now, evidently, federal security strategies come in very different forms. However, today I want us to think about what this strategy has looked like in Latin America and in Mexico in the last 20 years. And what it has looked like across presidential terms is a militarized security strategy where the federal government has directly involved the military in domestic policing. Now, while my work and that of other scholars has shown that this policy has had substantial consequences for democracy and the rule of law, we don't know much about how this militarized security strategy has changed policing at local level. And if my alignment theory is correct, then irrespective of structural features, this militarized security strategy should lead to the militarization of local policing. An outcome which is even more likely if we also take into account that the military's participation in domestic policing exacerbates conflicts of overlapping security jurisdiction, because security provision now requires a cooperation with the military. It also increases ambiguity regarding which security agency leads and which follows. And it also makes coordination more challenging given the professional differences between the military and the police. So for example, concerning their mission, police forces have a protect and prevent orientation. Instead, the military's focus is to overwhelm and pacify enemies. And as an interviewee best explained, I was in the army. And definitely the military ideology, the military way, or the military mystique is not about prevention. It is not even about dissuasion. The soldier wasn't prepared to engage with the community, but was prepared to eliminate risks. Regarding their mode of operation, whereas discretion and judgment are central aspects of policing, military personnel operate within a rigid hierarchical structure. As a former military officer reflected, soldiers have a particular way, not because we are soldiers per se, but the civilians' and military's mode of operation is very different. We ex-military still believe that orders are given and orders are followed. And lastly, the police and the military also differ in their expectations of their roles vis-a-vis the other. So for example, soldiers often see their responsibility to the public as superior. And I quote, the soldier sees a police officer as less, as second class. And just as soldiers have particular ideas about their role, so do civilian officers. So high-ranking police officers interviewed complained all the time that they, soldiers, know nothing about policing. Now, although there are multiple means through which governments might achieve alignment, such as through training and organizational restructuring, when it comes to federal security strategies that rely on the military for domestic policing, one of the least costly and most time-efficient ways for federal, state, and local governments to align their security strategies is by appointing military chiefs. So doing so is advantageous for the federal government because these appointments facilitate coordination. Given that, and I quote, the truth is that soldiers are used to working with other soldiers. For the military, recruiting military members into police forces allows it to operate as a central police authority. It can also help it amass greater resources, thereby strengthening its institutional position vis-a-vis the police. This was the case, for example, in Sinaloa in 2016 during Salvador Cienfuegos' term as Secretary of Defense. However, we must not lose sight also that military chief appointments can also be beneficial for state and local governments when others have appointed military chiefs, as it might mean gaining access to the federal government, facilitate coordination, and again, deflect blame for future unpopular security outcomes. So to summarize my theory on what explains the appointment of military chiefs at the local level, while I expect that some local governments will cave to the federal government's coercive pressures to appoint military chiefs, others will do so strategically when they see alignment as politically advantageous. So while Mexico is an ideal laboratory to test this argument, one of the difficulties that I faced is that police chief appointments have never been systematically documented, nor is this information publicly available. So I submitted over 2,000 right to information requests, known as FOIA requests in the US, to municipal and state governments on police chief appointments. And I complemented the information received with extensive research on newspaper articles. And as a result, I'd gathered information on 5,580 police chief appointments for 1,059 municipalities for the 2020 democratic period. Now, of course, in an ideal world, I would have data on all police chief appointments for all municipalities in Mexico. However, the reality is that I'm working with a limited sample. Now, I feel strongly about my limited sample because it is home to 84% of the Mexican population and 88% of police officers. But there are two things to note about my sample as I move on to talk about my results. The first is that the municipalities for which I have information are more economically developed and more populated. And this is something that I expected, given that answering a right to information request requires infrastructure in the form of a computer and internet. And the second is that because of historical data availability reasons, I have less information for the 2010 period compared to the 2010-2020 period. So let me give you some descriptives about these military chiefs. 841 out of 5,580 chiefs in my sample were military members, or 15.1%. And their appointment follows the same process as any other. The mayor selects a police chief who is then ratified by the local council, and their rank covers captains and lieutenants, admirals, and division generals. Plus, nearly all military officers appointed as chiefs are retired. There's also substantial variation in military chief appointments, with states like Baja California Sur and Nuevo León with over 30% of military chiefs. And there are also some clear temporal patterns in that military chief appointments significantly increased after December 2006, with the introduction of the military into the public safety arena. Now, while both of these patterns potentially speak to the possibility of a top-down alignment sequence, I follow a mixed methods approach to test my argument. And I follow a mixed methods approach because one of the biggest concerns with policy adoption models is that we might be attributing adoption to these interdependencies among political actors, as do I when I talk about course and strategic alignment, when in fact adoption results from common contextual factors. So to lessen concerns of spuriousness, I first follow a standard large N policy adoption model to test for a top-down militarization alignment sequence, and use different indicators to ensure that my results are not measurement or model dependent. And then I complement this analysis with an intensive analysis of the case of Nuevo León to examine this sequence and trace if the theorized mechanisms, coercive pressures, and strategic incentives, or both, are responsible for the proposed alignment sequence. So starting with a quantitative model, my DV is military chief appointment. This variable takes the value of 1 for every appointment, for every month year that a military chief is appointed, and 0 for every month year that a civilian is appointed. For the explanatory variables, the first part of my alignment theory again holds that preferences for militarized policing by higher levels of government will influence and spread across lower levels. So we should expect mayors to appoint military chiefs when both the national and state governments and peers have embraced a militarized security strategy. And to test for this sequence, I constructed 3 variables. The first is a federal militarized strategy, which is meant to capture the national government's reliance on a militarized strategy through military policing, and is comprised of 2 pieces of information: whether the federal government deployed the military to the municipality, and whether the military acted within the scope of a formal agreement between the state and the military to cooperate for public safety. Now, the second is state militarized strategy, which equals 1 for every appointment that occurs while the state police chief is a military member, and 0 for every appointment while the state police chief is a civilian. And the third variable is Peers militarized strategy, which is operationalized as at least one contiguous municipality having a military chief at the time of the appointment. I also have additional variables for robustness checks, and I'm happy to talk about these during Q&A. I also added municipality level and time controls to all models to account for alternative explanations offered by the crime control literature and also common shocks across municipalities. Now, while the work on crime control hasn't offered an explanation for military chief appointments explicitly, it does offer 2 explanations for the adoption of heavy-handed policing strategies. The first sees enforcement strategies as a response to structural violence. So high levels of crime promote more aggressive law enforcement practices. And to measure structural violence, I added the municipality's homicide rate. And I also added a binary variable following Magaloni and co-authors called turf wars, which measures significant and rapid changes in criminal violence associated with criminal organizations. The second explanation sees enforcement as a result of partisan affiliation and ideology. So on the one hand, conservative parties are more likely to adopt more punitive security policies. And on the other hand, mayors from the same party as a president are more likely to adopt policies dictated from above. So to get at this logic, I added a dummy variable for when the mayor belongs to the right-leaning National Action Party, the PAN, a dummy variable from when the mayor is a co-partisan with the president, and also a dummy for when the mayor is a co-partisan with the governor. All models, again, also include additional electoral controls. They all include year fixed effects, and they all use robust clustered standard errors at the municipality level. And concerning my estimation strategy, I use repeated event history analysis to predict the odds that a mayor appoints a military chief given past police chief appointments. So what do I find? I find supportive evidence for a top-down alignment sequence. So the odds of appointing a military chief, for example, controlling for other factors, increases by 52 percentage points when the municipality belongs to a state that signed a formal agreement with the military to cooperate for public safety compared to municipalities without military presence. 165% when, in addition to that agreement, the military patrolled the municipality, which I call centralized military patrols. Regarding the state's militarized strategy, the odds of a mayor appointing a military chief increase 130 percentage points when the state police chief is a military member than a civilian police chief. And further, Peers' reliance on a militarized strategy increases the odds of a military chief appointment by 60%. So regarding alternative explanations, I find partial support for the structural violence explanation. So significant and rapid changes in criminal violence increases the odds of a military chief appointment by 112%. However, I find no significant results for homicide levels. And interestingly and importantly, I find no support for the partisanship explanations, which to me speak to the fact that both right-leaning and left-leaning governments have broadly adopted militarized policing in Mexico. Now, there are also other interesting electoral results, which I'm happy to talk if anybody is interested, again, in Q&A. Now, whereas this quantitative evidence I showed you suggests that, as expected, police militarization at the national level encourages local militarization, it falls short of addressing the micro-level dynamics underlying this sequence. And documenting these dynamics is essential because my argument is ultimately about political actors and what motivates their behavior. Pressures, incentives, or both to align security institutions. So therefore, I turn to Nuevo León to trace these mechanisms based on 23 in-depth anonymous interviews with key actors and secondary sources. And I chose Nuevo León because this is an extreme case of intrastate police militarization, and thus can provide insight into my theory and mechanisms. Now, the key thing to know about Nuevo León is that by 2007, violence levels in the state were quite low. However, violence was beginning to spiral out of control in northern states like Chihuahua. And this encouraged the federal government to preemptively send 1,100 soldiers to participate in policing activities in the state in January 2008, under Operation Tamaulipas Nuevo León. Now, how does military policing work in Mexico for those that are unfamiliar? In this case, and bear with me because this information will become relevant in a couple of minutes. So Nuevo León belongs to the 7th military zone that falls within the 4th military region. So soldiers are stationed in the 7th military zone base, and from there sent on policing operations across the state. Now, by 2011, things get significantly worse. Homicides triple and many wealthy families flee the state. And this is why then Governor Rodrigo Medina decided to sign a cooperation agreement with Sedena, and an additional 3,500 soldiers were sent to the state to participate in policing operations. And as a result of the military's participation in policing in the state, in the words of one of my interviewees, in that time, one could say that the army took control of the state. Now, what does took control mean? As a police chief explained, and I quote, most police chiefs were former military. Mayoral meetings were held in the 7th military zone base, and the general, the Ministry of Defense's commander, directed the security meetings. Now, at the state level, we see the first state military chief appointed in February 2011, just 1 month after Governor Medina signed the cooperation agreement with Sedena. And before Castañeda, only civilians had held this position. And I argue that these appointments speak to the blurring of the lines between the police and the military, the civilian and the military spheres, when the military participates in domestic policing. Because, for example, people like Division General Magallanes had been commander of the 4th military region. Therefore, he was in charge of all military troops in Nuevo León before retiring from the army. He is then appointed as state chief, meaning he is essentially fulfilling the same role as commander, but now from the civilians' side. And for the military, having people like Magallanes running the state security apparatus is incredibly advantageous because it ensures that the state police will follow the military's directive. And it also allows the military to operate as a central police force, thereby avoiding ambiguity and conflict stemming from these overlapping security jurisdictions. And although all of these men have incredibly interesting stories, today I want us to focus on Brigadier General Cuauhtémoc Antúnez Pérez. Now, Antúnez was appointed in October 2015 by newly elected Governor Jaime Rodriguez. And by 2015, violence levels in the state had decreased substantially. And while one of my interviewees said that Antúnez was appointed because there was still a sense of emergency, as I expected with coerced alignment, another explained that Antúnez was appointed to avoid creating problems with the military. So Antúnez intensified the militarization of Nuevo León's security apparatus, leading some civilian leaders to label his time as state police chief as, I quote, the military invasion. And partly due to him not trusting civilians, there came a moment in which all top-ranking officers were military members. Now, these appointments created significant discontent among the rank and file, many of whom left the state police, and some who recounted questioning whether they were, and I quote, a military or a civilian force. Now, while all of this is happening at the state level, at the municipality level, and please turn your attention to the dark orange area in this figure, there were some early military chief appointments in 2009. But what is key in this figure is that military chief appointments increased considerably with the signing of the first cooperation agreement and General Bravos' appointment as state police chief in February 2011. Further speaking to that top-down sequence documented in the quantitative models and the central role of the state government in local militarization. So by 2012, 15 out of 51 municipalities in Nuevo León had military chiefs. And while this number might seem initially small, these municipalities actually comprise 90% of the state's population. Now, from the perspective of the state, I had the opportunity to interview a high-ranking military member and ask him what it was like to work with mostly military municipal chiefs, to which he responded there was coordination and goodwill. Now, when I asked him to explain why he described the relationship this way, he said, military members, especially those from the academy, form a brotherhood. There is also subordination, referring to the ranks. Their shared military formation, makes the work easier. You understand each other better. Now, from the municipality's perspective, when asked why mayors appointed military chiefs, one of my interviewees explained that as we would expect with strategic alignment, mayors take for granted that the military is in charge and has the full support of the federal government. Therefore, it, appointing a military chief, secures communication channels, assistance, and coordination with them. Similarly, another emphasized that mayors appoint military chiefs to wink at power or for power to wink at them. Having a military chief helps in their relationship with Serena. So take the case of Linares and Nuevo León. Since March 2012, all municipal police chiefs have been military members. And when Mayor Jose Roques, for example, was asked about who he was planning to appoint as his new police chief in 2013, as we would expect with strategic alignment, he said that he was waiting to get the approval of Division General Noé Sandoval. So Sandoval was at the time commander of the 4th Military Region, which means he oversaw all military troops in Nuevo León. And as we would expect with coerced alignment, one of my interviewees referred to Sandoval as a key player in ordering people, I mean, public security secretaries or police chiefs, to work. Now, beyond Nuevo León, the dynamics of military chief appointments in states like Coahuila, San Luis Potosí, Querétaro, Guerrero, Baja California Sur, Sinaloa, and Aguascalientes all lend support to my theory on that top-down alignment sequence. So to conclude, today I've shown you that political motives are a key driver in the degree to which the military has become embedded in urban security governance in Mexico. In both the quantitative models and in Nuevo León, what I observe are actors making choices to align security institutions, either due to coercive pressures, strategic incentives, or both. Now, this is not to say that once the federal government prioritizes a militarized strategy, police militarization subnationally is inevitable. However, my findings do point to how the need for interjurisdictional coordination can significantly change the opportunity cost of how politicians approach policing locally. Now, these findings have important theoretical implications. First, they underscore that policing is a profoundly political arena, and we should not lose sight of this. Second, the findings provide new insights into debates on the tensions between democracy and policing by showing how political motives shape how elected officials police the communities they govern. And third, these findings contribute to the study of police-military relations, which is often overlooked in the civil military relations literature. And by closely examining this relationship in the Mexican context, this study offers a new understanding of how the need for police-military coordination can change a country's entire security apparatus. Now, these findings also have important policy implications. First, these findings raise important questions regarding handing over the leadership of police forces to military personnel. Now, these appointments can normalize military dominance in public security and convey that civilians cannot solve societal problems, which can pose considerable risk to liberal democracy. Now, my findings also raise alarms regarding the now even more pressing need to build effective and trusted police at the local level in Mexico. And third, they invite us to think about what should be the role of the military in Mexico today. So I want to thank you very much for listening to my talk about my work, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that talk and for very, very provocative intervention. I'm opening here the floor for questions. Please use the hand reaction at the side down of your and okay, well, we'll start with Camilo.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Jessica. I have a question, or perhaps two questions, and they might take you a little bit beyond your presentation about the causes of militarization into the terrain of the performance of these forces when this happens. And it basically, on the one hand, what are the consequences for the police forces themselves in the sense, in this sense, does it mean that because a municipio has a soldier appointed as police chief, that there is something like a structural change in the way the force operates? Does it become more militarized, more military-like? And on the other hand, is there any discernible, and I know this is a very, very large question, but is there any discernible reduction or increase in violence once military commander takes over? Yeah, thank you.
Should I take one question and then respond? Yeah, Juan?
Yeah, I think that's better. So
Yeah.
also it gives people time to kind of chew a bit on the talk and think their own questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Camilo. You've touched on the second and third part of the book, literally. So what are the consequences for the police forces themselves? So this is research that I've already done. And what I did is I did a comparative analysis of 7 police departments to see what actually happens once a military chief goes into these police departments. And what I'm finding in terms of the police forces themselves is that this creates what I call bureaucratic destabilization. A lot of mayhem within these organizations. So you get the combination of a military chief with a civilian police force. Civilians start complaining about everything. They don't like their chief. They stop working. They abandon the force. There's a lot. It just creates a lot of mayhem within these departments and destabilizes them. This is compared to, for example, this is not the case when you have a military chief that recruits mostly former military officers to serve as their rank and file. So there are cases in Mexico in which this happens. And what they're creating are small armies that work really well because they all know each other and it's actually pretty efficient. Now, the second part of your question is, are there any discernible reductions in violence? That is a research that I'm conducting right now. That is a research that I couldn't do for the dissertation. And that is the third part of the book project, which is what are the consequences for things like robo de vehículo, like a bunch of different measurements that we care about in terms of security. I don't have an answer for you yet. My hunch is that I'm not going to see anything. That is, like, it doesn't really matter. The other thing that is really interesting about these police chiefs and the way that I, for example, measure bureaucratic destabilization is a tenure of, is their tenure. So how long are they serving as police chiefs? Most of them don't last over a year. It is really hard for them to stay in these police forces because of the things that I've talked about before, which are the professional differences. I mean, what happens with these military chiefs is that they want to change the organization to fit themselves. And that's when we see that breaking point. So I'm happy to talk about other parts of the research if you want to, but let me see if somebody else has a question, and if not, I'll jump back in.
I can jump in also in the meantime. I have a question related directly to what you were talking about, and I also have a follow-up question to something you said right now. So maybe I will present first a follow-up, so you can so we don't jump topics and then go back to a question of the presentation. Yeah, I was gonna say first, hopefully you don't find any results. In worst case scenario, you will actually find a worsening of violence in the places where and I was wondering what exactly do you mean, if you could specify the concept of kind of bureaucratic destabilization. Does that mean that police becomes less responsive, they become less efficient, there's less cases of like kind of persecute? What does this destabilization mean? And regarding the research itself, I was wondering, I find interesting this question of alignment theory, of sort of understanding that what explains that someone is nominated or designated, recruited really as a military chief, police chief, is the existence of the need to align with the federal policy. And so the predictors are this kind of agreements, for example, with the federal state, or the fact that the military has been deployed in these municipalities before. But then my question is, isn't it like a sort of two-step process? Because the question is, what does explain the agreement in the first place, or what does explain the military deployment in the first place, if not places that are perceived as more violent? Sort of going back, you just kind of kick the question of local violence one step back. Does that make sense? Or sort of, right, is it sort of the increase in the rate of homicides, for example, does not explain directly the nomination of someone as a military police chief, but it explains the signing off of the agreement that then explains the need for alignment. So how can one avoid sort of going back to this question of what causes the agreement in the first place? Sorry, that's a lot.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm here to answer questions. You're absolutely right. I mean, that is a concern. One thing to note is, I think there's about 50 something odd. I don't remember the exact number because I haven't looked at it in a while, but there's about 50 something agreements, and there's a ton of variation in why. So sometimes it is a federal government pressuring local levels. Sometimes it is because there's high violence. Sometimes you have cases like Hidalgo in 2013 in which there was no violence and they signed an agreement. So to me, this points to the fact that it isn't only violence driving the agreement, which then would explain the alignment sequence. Now, another thing to note is, I mean, when you add these controls in the quantitative models, if only, I mean, it's in the paper, but I can discuss it. If violence, for example, once I run the regression models only with violence and then add these agreements, if this variable were to be significant on its own and then disappears, then you're absolutely right. And that is not happening. It's always insignificant. So to me, those are two data points which are telling me violence is not doing all the explanation for these agreements, but there's so much variation in why these are being created that I'm not doing like a leap in terms of what is the true explanatory variable, which is what you're getting at in your question. But I had that same fear at the beginning of this research. Now, in terms of the first question, which I'm going to go back, what do I mean by bureaucratic destabilization? So this is just a term that I coined in order to be able to explain what I'm observing in these police departments. But by bureaucratic destabilization, I simply mean the disruptions in the inner workings of the police as an organizational actor. So I'm not looking at efficiency. I'm not looking at anything outside of the force, but only what is happening within the inner workings of the police. And what is happening in terms of inner workings, and measured in two ways, which is the tenure of these police chiefs and also disruptions in the works of the police, of police as actors, is that one, they're lasting really, I mean, they're not lasting more than a year again. They're kicked out pretty quickly. They don't like it. Neither military chiefs like it, nor police officers like having military chiefs. And the other thing is that you're seeing, for example, paros. So I talked, for example, about the case of Querétaro, in which they get a military chief and they decide to not work for days. That is what I call bureaucratic destabilization. They're not working. And this is not only the case in Querétaro. This has happened in more than one occasion. Puebla State, for example, had a military chief. And there was also a big demonstration to say, as military chiefs fuera. That was the banner that they were carrying when they were walking. So that is what I mean by bureaucratic destabilization. It's all about within these departments, what is happening. And the third question, which goes back to Camilo's, is, okay, what about efficiency? Does it really work? And my hunch is, one, it doesn't really work. And two, something that is really interesting also in the research that I've been doing is that there seems to be a learning process. So some mayors, I have a really interesting quote about from the mayor of Ahome in I don't remember where Ahome is. The mayor of Ahome says, like, we don't want military chiefs anymore. We want somebody that knows the municipality, because they have no idea, like they don't know anything about these municipalities once they start operating there. So it's a really interesting dynamic in terms of they're getting these chiefs thinking that they can solve absolutely everything. And again, my hunch, because of the data and the interviews, is that they're not solving anything, and they're creating even more problems within these departments.
We have a question posted in the chat. Also, I wanted to tell all the participants. Oh, we have also Ana Maria Serna with her hand raised. I also want to tell the participants that if you feel more comfortable writing or asking your questions in Spanish, you totally can. Jessica is Mexican, as you probably knew, and so because of the format, she'll probably answer in English. But please feel free, if you feel more comfortable, to ask in Spanish right away. Please, Ana Maria Serna.
Hi, thank you. I don't know what I did with my camera. I'm sorry. It's coming in. It looks like I'm praying because I have two different screens. But well, thank you for the presentation. I'm an old-fashioned historian, so I get a little lost with these government and public policy issues. But I'm also studying the memory of militarization through journalists and journalism. But I have a question that I always ask to researchers like you who work on these issues, and that I think that it seems that they don't think about it so much. Have you thought about corruption in both places, in the police and also in the military? Because I mean, a lot of people seems to think that the solution might be to go back to police forces, but we have the painful history of horrors now in the police. So I don't know if you plan to study corruption. And also you talk about political reasons, but you don't mention, for example, political repression that has been there forever when the military comes. And especially in those places like Nuevo León, those places, we will listen, as I've seen in the series, to Adela Cedillo, no? Those places where there was a guerrilla. Enfin, these issues are there. and what worries everyone so much, I think, in Mexico is that we might have again this tremendous repression, or as we have seen, extrajudicial killings, or using the force of the military for national security and not for public safety, no? So what do you think about that? And also, I had a question about political reasons. Do you see that the military chiefs are beginning to feel that they can rule something or some places, that they can come back to be political leaders or anything like that? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. I mean, yes, I mean, corruption is always something that you need to think about when you're talking about policing and the military. And very interestingly, I mean, this is not something that I explore in this paper, but it is part of like the larger research project, in that if we look at how people think about the military, they're always going to say, and when I say people, it's like a standard ciudadano Mexican citizen, it's like the military is less corrupt and more efficient. This belief is also generalized at the political level. So political leaders say the exact same thing. And when you go talk to these mayors or governors, they're gonna, I mean, I have quotes saying like they're less corrupt. So that's one way that we can solve corruption at the local level, is having a military chief. And they think that if they change the head of these departments, then that is going to solve absolutely every problem that they have. It is not the case, because you also, I mean, that is thinking that, as you said, the military is not corrupt. And one of the really interesting things is that, at least it is pretty clear in the case of Sinaloa in 2016 with Salvador Cienfuegos, is that the military is also using these appointments as a way of leverage to amass greater resources. So what they get is that they get governors to, for example, construct military bases for free. I mean, corruption abounds in that country, and I think it's something that you're absolutely right in that it has to be part of the conversation. It isn't something that I again focus on this exact research project, but it is there because it is part of the generalized belief about what these forces stand for. And I'm with you that, I mean, thinking about, no, I'm very against the idea that the military doesn't have a role to play. I think the military has a role to play, but the military has a role to play while you construct resilient, trusted and efficient police forces at the local level, which is something that, for example, the current president is not doing at all. And instead, he is taking resources away from these police forces. So I'm with you on the corruption. In terms of repression, I think it's important. This research project focuses primarily on the 2020-10 period. So I'm only looking at the democratic period, but it is part of the historical, I can't say that repression isn't something that political leaders think if we go back to 1968, the 1970s, and what the military stood for when it was tasked with the political survival of the PRI. So it isn't something that is coming up in the interviews on the current appointments, but I think it is necessarily part of the conversation if we think about military chief appointments pre-2000. So for example, thinking about Mexico City. And can they become political leaders? So I only know of one case, which is, what is it? The Tijuana, he was a former military chief who then served as a police chief of Tijuana. I'm blanking on his name right now. Give me 1 second. Who tried to be mayor twice, and he lost. Actually, that is the only case that I know of the jumping from former military officer to then police chief to becoming the mayor. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. If you give me 1 second to open my notes, I can let you. Leizaola, Julian Leizaola. He's a fascinating character. He actually lost by less than 1 percentage point, I think. So not that much of a jump. Some of the reasons that I found for why these military chiefs are doing this has not a lot to do with politics, but for them it has to do with resources. So it's a way to guarantee that they still are winning money after retirement. It's pretty much driven by economic reasons. And I think, it's all about economic reasons, and also it's about sort of helping your friends. So what they do is that they are named as police chiefs, and then they appoint all the next ranking, the rank right below them, all of their friends are appointed. So it's a way of helping each other out. So you're seeing like these little camarillas, but within these police forces of military members taking over them. And it's all about finances.
We have 5 minutes left, and we have 2 questions in the chat. So
I spoke a lot. Sorry.
No, don't worry. Don't worry. It's great. I'm just going to read both of them so we can try to do justice as much as possible to both questions. So the first is by Sharon Pines. She says, is there any correlation between a militarized local or state police force and increased extrajudicial violence? That's the first question. The second is by Keegan Boyer, and says, to what extent is militarization something novel in the past 20 years? Although I don't know very much beyond the capital, in Mexico City itself, nearly all police chiefs from the late 1910s to the early 1980s came from the military. And my impression from Thomas Rath's book is that the military was extremely involved in policing in the countryside in Puebla in the mid-20th century, although perhaps less through the appointment of military police chiefs than through simple direct military policing. I also wanted to ask, in terms of bureaucratic destabilization, how does this compare with similar disruptions that occur when civilian police chiefs that are disliked by the rank and file or mid-level officers are appointed? Finally, I think of policy prescriptions. How realistic is it to expect civilianization to significantly improve police public relations, given the long history of popular distrust of civilian police and civilian police violence? Sorry for writing, so don't worry, Keegan.
So super quickly, I'm going to try to tackle some of these. Maybe I can't all. Correlation between militarized local and state police forces and increased extrajudicial violence. So one way, I haven't looked at this data. One way we can approach this question is to get information from the CNDH on human rights abuse complaints. The tricky thing with this is that for the state and for local, the organization that is tasked with getting all this data are the state commissions. And there's so much variation in terms of efficiency of these commissions. So for example, I've tried to send freedom of information requests to all of the state commissions. And there are some, like what was it? I think it was the Morelos Commission, who never answered a request. So in terms of comparison, it's a bit tricky. I think you can do it, and it would be a really interesting question, but it introduces a lot of noise of whether you're whether you're attributing causality to militarization versus this could be explained to, for example, some of these commissions being better at getting data than others. It's a bit tricky. I just think it's not going to be such an easy task to do, but again, I think you can do it if you're interested. Is militarization something novel? And no, militarization is not novel, and that's why we say the remilitarization of public safety. As you said, Mexico City had military chiefs forever and ever and ever. And what I think is different, and why I say at the beginning of this presentation in terms of scope conditions, is that there was a very different logic to these military chief appointments when the PRI was ruling. This was a logic of political survival of the PRI. That's why they were being appointed to these positions, which has absolutely nothing to do with military chief appointments in this democratic era, which is where I position my argument and try to propose a new theory for why we are seeing the emergence, especially after 2006. But you're absolutely right in that these are not novel, and these are not novel, not only, Mexico, but the rest of Latin America. How does it compare in destabilization? I'm happy to share that if you're interested in destabilization. So what I also do in terms of trying to zero in on whether this is about military chiefs is to do a within case comparison. So before you had civilians, after you have civilians, suddenly you have military chiefs, and how do these compare across each other? And what I'm seeing is that in terms of tenure and disruptions, they are concentrated. The military chiefs are the ones that are lasting less that are lasting fewer years in these positions. There's more work to be done. I only have 7 case studies because I could only visit 7 police departments, but I am doing the work to again just tackle the causality of this question. And how realistic is it to expect civilization to significantly improve police-public relationship? There's a lot of work to be done. I don't think that once you don't have the military, then everything improves. Not at all, because we're talking about ingrained inelastic beliefs about the military and about the police. And changing this means years and years of good investment and working with these police departments and changing structures and changing processes and changing organizations. So in 10, 15 years, that's when you get that change. Is it possible? Yes, there are certain police forces that have been able to do this. And the best case to know is the police department of Neza, Ciudad Neza under Amador. They were able to do this. They were able to turn it around, and it's an interesting case to study.
We're in time, but thank you. That was amazing. You did tackle all those questions really quick and thoroughly. Camilo answered where you can find a recording of this session in the chat, and we wanted to thank you once again, Jessica, for joining us today and for a fantastic talk, for addressing all our questions, and hope that we keep in touch and keep discussing these things, because it's more important than ever, or maybe as important as ever. Okay, see you, everyone.
Bye.